December 1944. The Ardennes offensive caught the Allied Medical Corps unprepared. By the third day of the German breakthrough, field hospitals along the line were drowning. Not in combat, but in bleeding men they couldn't save. Plasma supplies, already scarce, ran dry within hours. Soldiers who should have lived died on operating tables because there was nothing to pump back into them. The machinery of triage reduced every soldier to a brutal calculus. How much blood do you have left? How many can survive on what remains? In a converted schoolhouse 20 miles behind what was supposed to be a stable front, Lieutenant Catherine Reeves, a nurse with 10 years of civilian experience and 18 months of war, faced an impossible choice. Her commanding officer had ordered her to stop giving plasma to the worst cases. Protocol demanded rationing, save it for those with a fighting chance. But Reeves had already watched 3 men die from decisions made by officers who weren't holding their hands when it happened. The solution came not from inspiration, but from desperation. Saline solution, albumin, and a theoretical calculation scribbled on the back of a casualty form. The mix wasn't approved. It wasn't tested. It violated every standing medical order, but it worked, and it would cost her everything if discovered. This is the story of what happened when one nurse decided that following orders meant nothing compared to the weight of a dying man's grip. Chapter 1. The sound of silence. The bombardment had stopped an hour ago, which meant the ambulances were coming. Catherine Reeves knew this rhythm now. The silence between salvos was more terrifying than the noise. She stood in the supply tent, checking inventory against a clipboard that bore yesterday's numbers, yesterday's impossibly optimistic numbers. 24 pints of plasma remained. 12 soldiers were already prepped for surgery. More were arriving with every convoy. The arithmetic was simple and damning. Outside, the December cold had turned the aid station into a place of blue lips and violently chattering teeth. The school building they'd commandeered still had its name painted above the door, École Sainte-Foy, but its windows were now covered with burlap, and the gymnasium had become an operating theatre. Orderlies moved through corridors, lit by gas lamps, their shadows stretched and monstrous against walls where children's drawings still hung. French schoolchildren's pencil sketches of sheep and farmhouses dated 1943, a year before the occupation ended, a year before this. How much do we have? Dr. Harmon appeared in the tent flap, his surgical gloves already off, his mask still hanging around his neck like the aftermath of someone else's decision. 24 pints. Catherine didn't look up. I checked twice. Harmon was silent for a moment. He was a good surgeon, steady hands, clear mind, but his eyes had stopped matching his voice 3 weeks ago. That's not enough, he said. I know. We have 12 more incoming. 2 of them are already exsanguinating. Catherine turned to face him. Harmon's left sleeve bore dried blood, someone else's blood, transferable as currency, meaningless as rain. Then we choose. That's not a choice, Harmon said. That's triage. That's the war. The ambulances began arriving at dusk. The drivers moved with the careful efficiency of men who'd learned not to shock the wounded. The patients came in on stretchers, their uniforms stiff with frozen blood, their eyes already distant, either from morphine or from the beginning of something deeper. Catherine watched the admissions officer tag them, watched doctors make their calculations, watched the operating room fill beyond capacity. By midnight, they were down to 8 pints. She calculated without being asked. 8 pints would keep maybe 5 men alive through the critical first hours. There were 47 men in beds, waiting, 17 more arriving. The mathematics of impossible choices had become routine. Catherine stood at the supply tent entrance and watched the snow fall. Each flake landed and vanished, temporary, unmemorable, part of a great emotion toward something. She thought of her mother's kitchen in Philadelphia, The pressure cooker hissing on the stove, her mother's hands moving with absolute certainty. Every action had a purpose. Every measurement meant something. A transport officer appeared beside her carrying a manifest. "Orders from division," he said. He didn't meet her eyes. "Plasma goes first to officers, then to men with extremity wounds who can return to combat. Head wounds and severe torso trauma get morphine and comfort measures." Catherine didn't take the paper. "That's not medical protocol." "That's resource protocol," he said. "There's a difference now." He left the orders on a crate and walked back to the motor pool. Catherine watched the manifest settle into the snow, watched it absorb moisture, watched the ink begin to run. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she went back inside and began calculating something else entirely. Something that would violate orders, contradict medical authority, and might just work. That's when she realized she'd already made the choice. She'd made it the moment she decided that protocol meant nothing against the weight of a dying man's grip. Chapter 2. Rationing light. The second night was worse because they understood what was happening. Word traveled through the aid station in whispers. Soldiers on gurneys talking to soldiers on cots. Orderlies confirming what they'd already guessed. Plasma wasn't just running low. It was gone. Officers were being treated. Enlisted men weren't. A private from Tennessee with a torn femoral artery would get morphine and a quiet end. A lieutenant with shrapnel in his thigh would get surgery and plasma and a chance at home. Catherine moved between beds, taking blood pressure readings, replacing dressings, whispering things to men that she didn't believe, but that sometimes helped them believe them. She was a Catholic, though she hadn't prayed since 1942. Now she understood prayer as a kind of lie you tell a dying person to make the ending easier. She became fluent in that language. "You're going to be fine," she told Private James Kovac, a 19-year-old from Detroit who was bleeding internally, and everyone knew it. His abdomen was distended, his breathing shallow. Without plasma and emergency surgery, he had maybe 6 hours. "No, I'm not," Kovac said. His voice was clear, almost conversational. "You're good at the lying, ma'am, but I'm from a family of butchers. I know what happens when the blood stops circulating." Catherine sat down on the cot beside him, something she wasn't supposed to do. "What was your name before Detroit?" "Kovac is the name." He smiled slightly. "My father came from Slovakia in 1912, opened a shop on Dearborn Street. My brother took it over when I enlisted." "Do you regret enlisting?" Kovac looked at the canvas ceiling of the ward. "I regret dying in a place I can't pronounce with someone I just met holding my hand. But that's the war, isn't it? You regret what you get, not what you wanted." She sat with him for an hour, until his breathing changed and his hand grew cold. She marked the time, 2:47 a.m., and moved to the next bed. This was the work that needed doing. This was the part that nobody told you about in nursing school. They told you about bandaging and medications and proper bedside manner. Nobody told you that you'd spend more time with the dying than with the living, and that the dead would outnumber the saved by ratios you'd have to accept or break. By dawn, 3 more men had died. The operating room had used the last of the plasma on a captain with a crushed pelvis who probably wouldn't walk again anyway. Dr. Harmon had looked at Catherine across the operating table and then looked away, a kind of apology that changed to nothing. It was Harmon who found her in the supply tent at 600 hours, standing over a collection of bottles and glass containers, her hands shaking. "What are you doing?" he asked. Catherine didn't turn around. "Saline, albumin, calcium chloride. The proportions are theoretical. They came from a medical journal I read in 1937, before anyone knew this war was coming. A French researcher was experimenting with alternatives to plasma for shock treatment." "Catherine, no. We have men dying for a resource we can partially substitute. The efficacy won't match whole plasma, but it's better than morphine, and goodbye." Harmon stepped closer. His exhaustion had aged him 10 years in 2 weeks. If this fails, if a man dies after receiving it, they'll court-martial you. They'll say you poisoned him. He's dying anyway, Catherine said quietly. At least this way, I'm choosing to try. That's more than I can do with any of them otherwise. Harmon was silent for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the operating theatre, leaving her alone with the bottles. Catherine understood that as permission. She called it plasma, though it wasn't. She labeled it carefully, logged it in the inventory book under Experimental Volume C, and prepared it for administration. The first batch would go to the worst cases, the men who had no chance with the existing protocol and every chance with something new. By the time the next convoy arrived, Catherine Reeves had already crossed the line from nurse into rebel. She didn't know yet what it would cost her. Chapter 3, The Invisible Protocol. The mix worked. Private Kovac didn't live. He died 40 hours after Catherine administered the first volume, and his death had nothing to do with plasma and everything to do with the shrapnel lodged against his spine. But he lived long enough to write a letter to his brother, long enough to dictate messages to other soldiers, long enough to matter for a few hours more than he would have otherwise. That was the space Catherine was working within now, not lives saved, but hours extended, seconds borrowed from a system designed to ration even hope. By the fourth day of the offensive, the experimental volumes had been administered to 17 men. 5 had died, their deaths no worse than the inevitable kind. 7 had stabilized enough to be evacuated to rear hospitals. 5 were still in the ward, awake, breathing, able to recognize visitors and speak without morphine dulling every word. The results were imperfect, unreliable, and impossibly precious. "We're using something," Dr. Harmon said quietly to Catherine between surgeries. It wasn't a question. "Something that isn't on the manifest." "No," Catherine said. "Don't lie to me. I'm complicit enough without that." She prepared another batch in the supply tent while he watched. The ritual had become routine, the measuring, the mixing, the careful notation that violated every regulation. Harmon said nothing. He simply prepared the IV lines and administered it to the men who would otherwise get only morphine. The problem arrived with Captain Marcus Webb, the division medical officer, a bureaucrat in a uniform who spoke in logistics and efficiency curves. He'd come to audit plasma usage against casualty rates to ensure that medical resources were being allocated according to protocol. 24 pints issued, he said, reading from the supply ledger. 37 men treated with plasma. That's a mathematical impossibility, Lieutenant. Catherine's hands didn't shake, though they wanted to. Some patients required multiple transfusions. No. Webb looked up from the ledger, and she understood that he'd already known. He was waiting to see if she'd lie. Multiple transfusions would be recorded. You have 7 volumes listed as Experimental Volume C with no donor unit numbers and no medical classification. What are they? Harmon stepped forward. Saline and albumin suspension, an alternative protocol for men in profound shock when plasma supplies are exhausted. That's not authorized. No, Harmon agreed. It isn't. Webb set down the ledger carefully. He was a thin man with careful eyes, and the particular cruelty of someone who'd never had to make a real choice because there were always orders to hide behind. You're aware that administering unauthorized substances to combat personnel constitutes— Yes, Catherine said, I'm aware. Then why? She met his eyes. Because they were dying. Because we had the means to try something else. Because your protocol was rationing death, not saving lives, and I couldn't maintain that calculus anymore. For a moment, Webb said nothing. Then he closed the ledger. Dr. Harmon, you're ordering these preparations. I am, Harmon said. Full responsibility is mine. And you, Lieutenant Reeves, you're manufacturing and administering them under direct medical order. Catherine understood what he was doing. He was building a structure of command that protected her by making her subordinate to orders she couldn't challenge. It was a lie, but it was a useful one. "Yes," she said. Webb stood, tucking the ledger under his arm. "Then I'll note it as authorized experimental protocol pending verification. Division Command will make the final determination." He paused at the tent flap. "The men you treated, the 5 who've stabilized, they wouldn't have made it with standard protocol." "No," Catherine said. "They'd be dead by now." "Then I hope your mathematics holds." He left before either of them could respond. After he was gone, Catherine realized she'd been holding her breath for the entire conversation. Harmon sat down on a crate, his head in his hands. "He'll report it," he said. "Yes. They might believe it's experimental. They might not court-martial." "They might," Catherine said. Harmon looked up at her. Was it worth it, knowing what's coming? Catherine thought of the 5 men alive in the ward who would have been dead. She thought of Kovac's letter to his brother. She thought of the choice between following orders and following her conscience, and how the two had become impossible to reconcile. If this story feels real to you, tell us in the comments. What would you have done in their place? Chapter 4. The Offensive's Shadow. The Battle of the Bulge was shifting. By day 5, the German breakthrough that everyone had believed impossible was becoming undeniable. The front that was supposed to be stable had collapsed in multiple sectors. Reinforcements were being pulled from everywhere to contain the breakthrough. The aid station, which had seemed safely behind the lines, began receiving wounded from increasingly disorganized units. The casualty patterns changed too. No longer isolated incidents and patrols. Entire companies were coming in shattered, their unit structures dissolved by the chaos of German armor columns punching through snowed-over forests. The men arriving now had a different kind of wound. They carried the shock of complete organizational collapse. Catherine's experimental volumes became routine. What had started as desperate improvisation was now standard procedure, not authorized by Division Command, which remained silent, but essential by the mathematics of available resources. Harmon had stopped noting them in the official ledger. Instead, he kept a parallel record, a ghost inventory that existed only in a notebook he kept in his surgical bag. "If they find that, you go down for it too," Catherine said. "I know," Harmon replied, "but if they don't find it and someone questions why 5 men who should be dead are still alive, I need documentation, not to protect myself, to protect you." The 3rd week of the offensive, the Germans had been contained but not defeated. The weather cleared briefly, and Allied air superiority asserted itself again. Supply lines, which had been strangled and desperate, began to normalize. Real plasma arrived. Not enough, never enough, but measurably more than the rationed trickle they'd been working with. It was strange, receiving real plasma again. Catherine felt a kind of relief, and also a kind of loss. The experimental volumes had been an impossible choice, transformed into a kind of strange certainty. You mixed them, you administered them. You watched men survive or die by margins. You could see and measure. Now she was back to standard protocol, and it felt like privilege, or cowardice. Division Command's response arrived on day 23. A classified memo authorizing continued experimental plasma protocols pending post-war medical review. No court-martial, no investigation, no acknowledgement of what had actually happened, just a bureaucratic door left just open enough for plausible deniability. Harmon read it twice. "They're protecting themselves," he said. "If the mix worked, they can claim they authorized it. If it failed, they can say it was experimental medicine in impossible circumstances." "Does it matter?" Catherine asked. "No," Harmon said, "but it means you're not going to prison. That matters to me." That night, Catherine sat in the supply tent and counted. 17 men treated with experimental volumes, 8 dead, 5 evacuated to rear hospitals and listed as stable, 4 still in the ward, improving daily. The mathematics of her rebellion had yielded a 5% net survival rate over the alternative, which was 0%. 5 lives extended beyond the math that would have killed them. She didn't know yet if that mathematics would be enough to live with. Chapter 5. The weight of witnesses. By early January, the German offensive had been arrested. The salient pushed back. The front, which had swallowed whole divisions and shattered command structures, was beginning to calcify again. A new line, similarly impermanent, similarly defended by men and supplies that were never quite enough. The wounded still came, but differently now. These were men from the counter-offensive, soldiers pursuing the retreating Germans through forests filled with hidden positions and cold that froze the fluid in rifles. They came in with frostbite and shrapnel and the particular exhaustion of men who'd learned that even winning a battle meant burying it in snow and moving on. The experimental volumes were still being used, though with less frequency now. Real plasma was more reliable, and nobody asked questions about innovations that worked once the crisis had passed. Catherine had administered 43 volumes total. 18 men had died. 12 had been evacuated as stable. 7 were still in the ward, their recovery progressing day by day. She never spoke to them about what they'd received. The official records, if anyone checked them carefully, would show standard plasma administration. The ghost notebook in Harmon's surgical bag was the only document that recorded what had actually happened. In 2 weeks, he would burn it, and the record would exist only in memory. That's when Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison arrived from Army Medical Command to conduct a formal inspection. Morrison was the opposite of Captain Webb, not a bureaucrat, but a doctor. Someone who'd been a surgeon before the war and had maintained something like principle in his navigation of military medicine. He spent 4 hours at the aid station reviewing cases, speaking to patients, examining the ward. He asked to speak with Catherine privately. 5 men alive, he said without preamble. According to casualty projections and triage protocols, they should be dead. But they're not. And the paperwork suggests you administered something that isn't documented. Catherine didn't answer. There was no safe answer to that question. I'm not here to investigate, Morrison said. I'm here because I read Dr. Harmon's medical journal, the peer-reviewed article about your experimental protocol, written 6 months before the war. I came to see if you'd actually had the nerve to try something like that under combat conditions. And what did you find? Catherine asked. Evidence that you saved 5 men's lives. Evidence that the protocol is not as effective as whole plasma, but demonstrably more effective than morphine alone. Evidence that you made a choice that violated orders and probably saved lives anyway. He paused. The question is whether that choice was medicine or rebellion. Does it matter? Catherine said. They're alive either way. It matters enormously, Morrison replied. Because if it was rebellion, you're a cautionary tale about soldiers who think they're smarter than command structure. But if it was medicine, if you applied research and training and judgment to an impossible situation and were right, then you're something else entirely. You're someone who understood that the rules were designed for normal conditions, and normal conditions don't exist in war. He stood to leave. I'm recommending your experimental protocol for formal adoption as authorized emergency procedure. It will be studied, it will probably save more lives, and your name will be attached to it. He paused at the door. That means the choice stops being rebellion and becomes history. You comfortable with that? Catherine wanted to say no. She wanted to say that history was for people who'd had no other option. But she thought of Kovac, of the 5 men alive in the ward, of the 7 who'd been evacuated. She thought of a choice that was never really a choice at all, just the only thing that made sense when you were standing in a schoolhouse in Belgium with dying men and the means to try something different. "Yes," she said, "I'm comfortable with it." If this battle still echoes in your mind, hit like. It helps these untold memories stay alive. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The experimental protocol was officially adopted on January 15, 1945, with Morrison's endorsement. Within a week, 5 other aid stations had been provided with the formula and instruction. Catherine received a letter from the Army Surgeon General acknowledging the innovation. She was mentioned briefly in a military medical bulletin. Her rebellion had transformed into regulation, and nobody questioned it anymore because it had stopped being a violation the moment it became authorized. But authorization didn't absolve anything. If anything, it made the choice heavier. She thought about this one afternoon in the 3rd week of January, sitting in the supply tent with Harmon, watching him burn the ghost notebook, page by page. The parallel record of what had actually happened dissolved into ash and smoke. Names, dates, volumes, the documentation of their unauthorized choice turning to nothing. "Are you relieved?" Harmon asked. "No," Catherine said. "I feel like I'm destroying evidence. Like we're making it easier for everyone to forget what really happened." "What really happened," Harmon said quietly, "was that you violated medical protocol and military orders and probably saved lives doing it. That's not something the Army wants documented clearly. Better to bury it, authorize it retroactively, and move on. Cleaner, safer. For them. For everyone," Harmon said, "including you." But Catherine found that safety didn't feel like relief. It felt like a different kind of violation, the violation of silence, of complicity made official. The 5 men who'd lived seemed to know it too. They didn't thank her in elaborate ways. They just carried the knowledge of their survival quietly, understanding that they'd been saved by someone else's willingness to break the rules. When they were evacuated to rear hospitals, they left notes. One thanked her for the extra hours. Another apologized for the blood work she'd had to do multiple times. A third, a sergeant from Kansas, simply wrote, "I'm going home because you decided to try something different. I hope that choice doesn't cost you." It might, Catherine thought. It probably would, eventually. Rules that are broken quietly today become historical footnotes or courtroom evidence tomorrow. Morrison had protected her by making the choice official, but officialdom was fragile, dependent on the memory of the people in power and their willingness to remember a nurse's rebellion as innovation rather than insubordination. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945. The German offensive had been contained, absorbed, eventually thrown back. The front stabilized once more, though stabilized just meant that the casualties would continue at a lower, more sustainable rate. The aid station at École Sainte-Foy began receiving fewer wounded. Supply lines normalized. The crisis that had demanded improvisation passed into military history. On February 1st, Catherine received new orders. She was being transferred to a rear hospital in England for staff rotation, 3 months away from the line, a reward for exceptional service. Harmon didn't get transferred. He was needed here, and the Army's gratitude to Catherine was expressed through temporary removal from the place where she'd committed her violation. Before she left, she spent an evening walking through the ward one final time. Most of the men were from more recent casualties, the slow bleed of combat that replaced the flood of the offensive. They didn't know her name. They wouldn't have known about the choice she'd made during the crisis weeks. The 5 men she'd saved with the experimental protocol were already gone, scattered to different hospitals, different countries, different lives. She would never know what happened to them, whether Kovac's brother in Detroit ever received his letter, whether the men who'd survived made it home or died in some other place, in some other way. But she carried them anyway. The weight of their survival had become part of the weight she carried, not as vindication, but as evidence. Evidence that breaking the rules could produce something other than chaos. Evidence that protocol could be an obstacle to what mattered. Evidence that a nurse in a Belgian schoolhouse had faced a choice between following orders and following conscience, and that the choice had made a measurable difference. She didn't know if that would be enough to live with. She thought it might have to be. Chapter 7. The Silence. After the rear hospital in England was orderly, clean, and almost peaceful in its distance from combat, Catherine moved through 3 months of staff rotations, training newer nurses in procedures that seemed almost quaint compared to what she'd learned in Belgium. The war continued. Everyone knew it would for at least another year, but here it was theoretical. A concept discussed in briefings and casualty reports, not the immediate reality of mud and blood and impossible mathematics. She received a letter in March. It was from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, informing her that the experimental plasma protocol had been adopted across all Army medical commands. Conservative estimates suggested it had already been used in over 300 cases. At least 60% efficacy rate compared to the alternative. That meant she might have helped save, indirectly, somewhere around 90 lives. The letter was official and carefully worded to avoid acknowledging that this was anything other than a standard medical innovation. It was also, she understood, the closest thing to absolution she would receive. She read it and put it away. The math of 90 lives was its own kind of weight, neither lighter nor heavier than the weight she'd been carrying since January. In May, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Catherine wasn't sent back to the continent immediately. The army was still reorganizing, still processing the question of what happened to medical personnel when the immediate crisis of combat medical triage dissolved into the slower crisis of peacetime medicine and, eventually, forgotten history. She thought about this while lying in her bunk one night in early June, listening to other nurses celebrate the end of the war in Europe. They were talking about going home, about civilian life, about the families waiting for them. Catherine couldn't access that happiness. She felt instead a kind of suspension, caught between the weight of what she'd done and the lightness of discovering that it was already becoming invisible. By August, she was discharged and back in Philadelphia. Her mother asked her about the war, and Catherine told her the outlines. Field hospitals, wounded men, long hours. She didn't talk about the choice in Belgium, about the experimental volumes, about the 5 men who'd lived because she'd decided protocol was less important than the possibility of saving lives. Some choices exist in a space where language can't reach them. She returned to civilian nursing at Pennsylvania Hospital, where the work was urgent but not desperate, where lives could often be saved through conventional means, where protocol existed because it usually worked. She was good at it, efficient and careful. But there was something missing in the ease of it, some kind of sharpness that had been worn smooth by conventional success. In 1952, Dr. Morrison published a paper in the Journal of Military Medicine documenting the experimental plasma protocol and its results across the European theatre. Catherine's name appeared as a co-author, though she hadn't written any of it. The paper was careful, academic, scrubbed of the urgency and terror that had motivated the original choice. It presented the innovation as the result of research and trial, not desperation and rebellion. She received a copy in the mail with a note from Morrison. History sanitized is still history. You saved lives, and that's what matters. The rest, the chaos, the fear, the choice between rule and conscience, that's the part nobody talks about. But you'll remember it. That's the part that's real. She kept the paper, but she didn't read it carefully. She didn't need to. She could recite the experimental volumes in her sleep, the proportions, the calculations, the careful mixing that had defied military logic, but followed a different kind of logic entirely. The logic of survival, the logic of choosing to try something when everything else would fail. Catherine never married. She never spoke about the war in any detail. She worked at Pennsylvania Hospital for 37 years and trained hundreds of nurses in protocols that came directly from the experience of combat medicine. Though she never explicitly said so, she taught them that rules existed for reasons, but that exceptions existed for other reasons. Equally valid, equally human. When she retired in 1982, the hospital gave her a small ceremony. They called her an exceptional nurse, a dedicated professional, a valued colleague. Nobody mentioned the war. Nobody mentioned Belgium or the choice or the 5 men who'd lived, because one nurse had decided that protocol was less important than possibility. That's how history survives when it involves people who prefer silence. Not through testimony or explanation, but through the quiet persistence of people who've made choices and live with them, who carry the weight of decision into every ordinary moment after the extraordinary ones have passed. Catherine died in 1997, at age 79. In her will, she donated her papers to the Army Medical Museum, everything she'd kept from the war, including the letter from Dr. Morrison and a handwritten copy of the experimental plasma formula. The museum catalogued them without fanfare. They remain there still, available to researchers, a small record of a choice made under impossible circumstances, of protocol, broken and then rewritten, of a moment when one person decided that rules mattered less than the possibility of saving lives.